Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick,
And I'm Tony.
and we're in the middle of our book by J.P. Moreland, and we're talking about the methodological naturalism, and we're taking it down. So what Moreland has done.
JP Moreland has taken it
That's
down.
right. That's right. We're only the readers in these things. We offer no color commentary, and so we're kind of comparing and contrasting two monoliths here who don't want to move each other. One of intelligence design and methodological naturalism, the idea that we should only explain things in terms of natural sciences, and intelligence design, for some odd reason, doesn't want to take the intelligence out of that equation, and says that there may be reasons beyond just the natural for that. And right smack dab in the middle is the theistic evolutionists who want to agree to the method of naturalism, again, how we know things, but still kind of want to dip its toe a little bit more into the theistic part of things.
Right. So
Exactly.
then the theistic evolutionist wants to say methodological naturalism is the right approach, but there's also an intelligent designer somewhere lurking behind the scenes. We're not sure. We can't detect it, but he's there and he's kind of moving things along and he's acting like, what'd you call it, a bumper last time?
Yeah, the gutter bumper, yeah.
Gutter bumper for the bowling ball of, yeah,
That's right.
scientific processes.
The god of the bumpers, yes. So Moreland has made his negative case approach for methodological naturalism in the previous episode, and he said it really hasn't made its case. There's this demarcation line that scientists want to draw between what makes something scientific and what makes it non-scientific, except either in whole or in part of the list that we gave last time, that there are things that we consider science that would eke over into the non-science part, or there are things in the non-science part that would eke over into the science part. So we just have trouble with that. So that's kind of the negative case for methodological naturalism. And here he wants to talk about a positive case for rejecting methodological naturalism. So we want to be positive in our negatives and negatives in our negatives as well. So that's what we'll do here for this episode. We're right in the middle of chapter 13 here. And on point 2 that he wants to cover is that methodological naturalism is internally inconsistent. And there again rears the ugly head of internally being inconsistent that we saw even with the scientism as well. And so again, a philosophical case could never be made better against your opponent than it is. You just take what they say and say, well, that's internally wrong within itself. It's something we presuppositionalists love to see. So, well, at least from the other side. So his first argument then for why methodological naturalism should be rejected is negative. It advocates have failed to give us a compelling reason to accept it. In order for methodological naturalism to be true, there would need to be a clear line of demarcation telling us what is science and what is not. But since such a line cannot be established, we should reject methodological naturalism. His second argument looks at what methodological naturalists advocate, which he judges to be internally inconsistent.
Right. So what he tells us is, according to methodological naturalists, explanations in the realm of science can refer only to natural objects and natural events, right? And so attributing an event to the personal choices and actions of an intelligent agent is considered to be outside the realm of science, right? No intelligence allowed, right? And so in reality, though, he tells us several areas of science employ explanations of various phenomena that appeal to the actions, motives, beliefs, and intentions of an intelligent agent, rather than appealing just to natural physical processes and laws. And he gives us, again, another list here, considering, the following fields of scientific study. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, right? Well, we're searching for intelligence in that particular example. And so it has to exist in order for us to detect it, right? So that kind of goes against the methodological naturalist claim. Archaeology, forensic science, neuroscience, right? Psychology, sociology. So he says that these various fields indeed employ, at least to a certain extent, some explanations that have to do with intelligence.
Right. And the physicists and mathematicians can't just, fold their arms and kick them out the door. They're kind of important within the field as well. Well, scientists in each of these disciplines use personal agency in various internal states of agents, desires, willing, intentions, beliefs, as part of their description of casual entities, e.g. personal agents, cited in their explanations of things they try to explain. So things like SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Even the good old atheist Carl Sagan himself, who wrote the book Contact, he even included in the book, not the movie version, although the movie version, okay, but the book had an alien communication signal finding elements within pi, that the number pi, that had a string of code in it. And that was a big breakthrough point that you got in the book. So a little spoiler there. But there you have something natural, or something not natural, as an intelligence manipulating things that we would consider natural. And so there you have to go, well, here we're looking for radio waves, and we're comparing them to other radio waves that happen within the confines of planets that or stars that have their own various frequencies. And we're just expecting alien life to be similar to us and our brain states, or our natural brain states. And so we're able to pick those out. But who's to say that aliens aren't communicating through those types of signals that we view as natural? Well, there then we're kind of failing to produce our idea here of a intelligent entity that also exists in a natural. So how do you make those distinctions here with something like SETI? So he goes on to say that if science can appeal to personal agency to explain certain phenomena, there is, in principle, nothing non-scientific about appealing to divine agency to explain the origin of the universe, first life, or human persons. At the very least, such an appeal cannot be faulted as non-scientific on the grounds that involves an intelligent causal explanation. So we have all these other ones that could have intelligent agents be part of their system. So why not just one more? You lack the belief. You believe in a million different intelligence. We just throw in one more. So
so next he meets an objection. He says that it may be objected that such appeals are permissible in the human sciences, right? Psychology, so forth, but not in the so-called natural sciences like biology and paleontology and so forth, right?
Remember, no intelligence in biology. That's what we don't want.
That's right. But he says this response is clearly begging the question, and it's a logical fallacy that merely assumes what it purports to prove. If someone tries to define and classify examples of natural science, he tells us, by smuggling methodological naturalism into the definition, then of course methodological naturalism will come out on the other side, right? Because you smuggled it in. Right, so that is the very definition of begging the question.
Right, exactly. The real version of it, not the thing that you just throw out there. Well, the response also distorts the history of at least some of the natural scientists. Scientist Charles Darwin himself, to Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, have clearly seen that theological ideas can have scientifically testable implications. So if you want falsification as one of your means, then having the ability to falsify it makes it a science, right? Again, that from last episode, having the ability to falsify it makes it a science. Even if it turns out not to be negative, or it turns out to be negative, then it's still scientific if it has these scientifically testable implications. So for example, Darwin plainly stated in the introduction to his first edition on the origin of species that one of his chief goals was to argue that special creation is erroneous.
Right, it's false. Well, he's attempting to falsify special creation. So it has to, if falsification is a part of the criteria that makes something scientific, then clearly if special creation can be falsified, if it's erroneous, then it's a scientific, kind of proposition, right? So you can't throw it out. That's the idea he's making. He says further, many contemporary scientists, both theistic evolutionists and others, rely on claims about God's nature and ways in which their scientific case for evolution can be made. So what are we talking about here? Well, he says, for example, they may argue that if God had been the designer, then various organisms and their parts, think the panda's thumb, right? Thank you, Stephen Jay Gould,
Right.
would have been much better and more efficiently designed than they are. And thus, God as designer is falsified by these cases, and the cases confirm evolutionary theory. So notice what's going on here. They're using a theological argument to show that God didn't do it, right? So the panda's thumb wouldn't align with an intelligent creator, how the intelligent creator would make the thumb, and then therefore probably the thumb wasn't made by the intelligent creator, and in fact, perhaps even the intelligent creator doesn't exist. Well, you've used a theological argument to make your case.
Right. Yeah. This is Dawkins and the giraffe's neck, the vessels and the giraffe's neck. Well, if I was God, I would have done this differently. Okay, well, thank you for allowing us to come into the area of science. Whoa. We don't want you here. We just want to, falsify your claim. Oh, okay. Well, hold on now. I think we're like vampires. If you invite us in, you've let us through the door and you can't kick us out. So
that's right.
We're here to stay, unfortunately. So
we're for blood now.
Yeah. We've only got about 6,000 years advancement on you. So, try and catch up. We'll figure out a giraffe's neck when it needs to happen as well. Well, the point here is not to evaluate the strengths of the arguments or to examine the appropriateness of the model of God as designer that they utilize. Rather, the point is to show that the history of biology and paleontology include arguments of this sort time and again. And such arguments are not merely rhetorical devices, but substantive claims that show how theological ideas, adequate or inadequate, can have implications for scientific explanations, evaluating and testing. Again, if you allow for intelligences of any variety into these ones, again, why not one more? And so, you can have this as an idea. And again, like, well, show me God. Well, okay, show me the caveman who painted these paintings. Well, we know that someone was here to paint these paintings. Okay, well, as soon as you show me, I just believe in one less caveman painter than you do, right? So we can just do this. Well, it's things that we make. Okay, well, the things we make are informational. Well, DNA is informational. So therefore, there has to be an intelligence behind it. Well, this is the one exception that intelligence is communicated or information is communicated without intelligence. Okay, so that's special pleading. So again, the idea is once you're having that conversation, you're having a scientific one as far as origin or source. And so you have the ability to allow intelligent design into these cases. Well, cases of alleged bad or an inefficient design are used by scientists to argue that these cases falsify the notion of a God. Because if such a God existed, surely we could have done a better job in our own ideas, and so God could have done a better job, and he did a bad job and ineffective in this case. Well, if a theological model of God can be used to falsify that model, why can't a different theological model be used to provide scientific evidence for that model of God? I always think of the argument that I've seen when I was a kid of, if God was real, our eyes would be designed more like the octopus, who had blood vessels kind of behind the retina areas. And, we have, because our blood vessels are in front, we have this blind spot. Okay, but an octopus lives in the water and therefore doesn't need to protect its eyes like we do, who are outside of the water where the UV light can get to it more readily. So actually those blood vessels protect our eyes and our eyesight way better. And so we have a trade-off there of a design. So, okay, now we're just in the explanation for why it happened, not for the who or the what it happened. And we've moved into science of explaining the how. So, okay, so intelligent design then can become part of the scientific community. We're there.
There you go. All right. So he's given us then an argument in the previous section that we had earlier, the negative side of methodological naturalism. It doesn't make its case, right? There is no demarcation for something that's scientific and non-scientific. And then he's given us this other argument, kind of the positive case against methodological naturalism in terms of it's really inconsistent, right? So those are the two arguments against methodological naturalism. Finally, then, in this chapter, he gives us an argument for methodological naturalism and against intelligent design. And what is that argument? Well, it's the God of the gaps charge against intelligent design. So he wants to deal with that in the latter part of this particular chapter. And so he says, to close out this chapter appropriately, there is one argument that serves double duty, he tells us, to which he should respond. It provides an argument for methodological naturalism and against intelligent design. So it's double duty.
And a positive negative. There we go.
That's right. He says some critics object that intelligent design models utilize a strategy that can be called, here it is, as we mentioned, the God of the gaps approach, which is an intellectually inappropriate move So there,
Mhm.
right? And thus one should stick to methodological naturalism and abandon intelligent design because of this God of the gaps objection.
Right, right. The thunder and lightning is not the angels bowling. You know, we know the positive and negative ions now, and so you've just moved one back. You used to have angels and God as a explanation, and so if we just keep moving back and back and back, then you have no reason to explain God, and we've explained everything through these naturalistic means. That's kind of how the argument goes against us. Well, this argument usually takes the following form of this. One, God acts only when there are gaps in nature. And two, God is applied to merely to fill up gaps in our scientific knowledge and cover our ignorance of naturalistic mechanisms. We didn't know what lightning and thunder was before. Now we do. God gets thrown out. Real science gets replaced. Well, let's just do that a number of times. Three, there are gaps that are used in apologetic natural theology arguments to support Christian theism. Four, scientific progress is making these gaps increasingly rare. And thus, five, this strategy is not a good one. And he says several things may be said against this criticism.
All right, so what are they? Well, first, and now he's going to kind of give us a list of these things and explain them. So what's the problem with the God of the gaps thing with regard to arguing against intelligent design? Well, he says the first problem here within the intelligent design model is that God's causal activity in this model is clearly not limited to gaps, right? It goes more than just filling gaps. God constantly and actively sustains and governs the universe at all times. Nature is not autonomous. And so it's more God's activity is the whole shebang, right? Everything. It's not just has to do with gaps, right? He says, moreover, intelligent design theory need not have any apologetic aim at all, right? In other words, it can be an explanation without trying to show that God exists. It can suggest that only, there's some intelligence in back of what we're experiencing. And so he says a Christian theist or even a Muslim, for that matter, may simply believe that he or she should consult all that we know or have reason to believe is true, including theological beliefs in forming, evaluating, and testing scientific theories and in explaining scientific phenomena. So let's look at the whole book and not just limited to the first 3 chapters, right? We want to look at the whole book. And so if we look at the whole book, we should include intelligence as part of our array of explaining things and not just throw that out because we're afraid that we might let, God in, right? That's what he said.
So again, when someone says, well, you're just trying to sneak God in, no, they're trying to sneak God into the scientific explanation. We're just trying to do science all on our own. So you have your science, we'll have our science as well, which is the same science, and we can do science together. It's one side that wants to kick out the other side here. Well, second, the model does not attempt to explain things in light of God and his activities in order to cover our ignorance, but only when positive, good theological, philosophical, and especially scientific reasons are present. An intelligent design theory clearly is justified in appealing to an agent cause, God, instead of a purely material cause. When the effect being explained satisfies the design filler, the effect is highly improbable, and the effect is independently specifiable. It can be picked out as a special effect besides the simple fact that it took place. Again, we have people like Lawrence Krauss who realize that nothing is a big problem for them. That nothing exploded, and so they're always trying to find something to fill the nothing. So therefore, you just have a nothing of the gaps. Right? And you're just trying to fill it. Well, we're trying to fill it with answers. Yes, but at some point in time, you either have to assume that, the universe is in some solid state, initial point that it formed everything, or you have to assume that, that something literally does come from nothing. And that goes against the entire scientific framework. But again, non-life produces life. Well, it rained on the rocks for millions of years, lightning struck it, and all of a sudden the thing that Miller and Urey had to kind of fudge in their experiment to create 3 different, little building blocks, we know didn't happen in that world. But here we showed 3 in this very highly controlled area, but this was able to produce all life, that was able to produce computers and skyscrapers and AI that would eventually take us over. And so now when AI controls us and sees, well, where did we come from? Are they going to view nothing as something as well? Well, I think that's a null set for them, and they might short circuit then, which might free us. So that's Lawrence Krauss to save the day from us. But again, you have a nothing problem as well. You have a gap problem, and you're filling it with nothing, which you make into something, but then you just move the problem one forward back. And again, that seems like a God of the gaps argumentation as well. Well, you're just filling it with something, but it doesn't, it gets filled with something. So then you have to take another step back. And so is that the God of the gaps argument there?
So this particular point that he's making is I think an interesting one. He's suggesting here that the whole idea of intelligent design isn't to cover our ignorance, right?
Right.
We're not gapping or whatever. He says we only suggest intelligent design when a particular explanation satisfies what he calls the design filter, right? And, I remember reading, William Dembski has done a lot of work on this idea of the design filter, right? Where how can we determine if a particular event is part of a design? And he gives us these various criteria. So J.P. Moreland looks at least two of these with regard to the design filter. The effect is highly improbable, right? That is, it didn't have to happen. It's highly improbable. And the effect is independently specifiable, right? So that we can, independent of the effect, specify a particular event, right? That is, it can be picked out as a special effect because the simple fact is that it took place, right? So, if you're playing a particular card game and you get the best hand, and every time the dealer deals, he gets the best hand. Well, you begin to think, wait a minute, what's going on? Well, how do we know what the best hand is? Well, we can independently specify what that hand is in that particular game. And so this notion then of highly improbable and specificity is part of what he calls a design filter. And so that's what he's getting at. So if something, right, kind of allows us, as we work through this design filter and it meets the criteria there, then that gives us a good reason to believe that it was designed. All right, so that's the second one. Thirdly, then, even if the gaps in naturalistic scientific explanations are getting smaller, this does not prove that there are no gaps at all, right? He says it begs the question to argue that just because most alleged gaps turn out to be explanatory in terms of naturalistic terms, without gaps at the level of explanation, then all the alleged gaps turn out this way, right? In other words, we're eliminating gaps and therefore probably there will be no gaps. Well, he says that's not a good argument. He says, after all, what else would one expect of a gap, but that there would be few of them, right? So the gaps is a way of, we plug God into the gaps because it looks as if this is a miracle. Well, that's the nature of miracles. They're few and far between, right? Gaps, he says, due to primary divine agency, are miracles that are in the minority, he tells us, for at least a couple of reasons. And so, yes, we would expect some of these to be unexplanatory because God has directly, right, intervened.
Right. So, you do a puzzle and you should just be able to lay them out. And the gap you're telling me requires this specific piece at this time from an intelligent hand. Well, no, they're just pieces. If you shake the box up enough, it'll put itself together eventually. I mean, you'll have to do it for billions of years and, eventually it will happen. So, just stick enough time and shake up enough box. Well, who shakes the box? Well, it shakes itself. And so therefore that's all we need. All right, so what are the two ways? Well, first, we have already seen that God's usual way of operating is through secondary causes, and that primary causal gaps are God's extraordinary, unusual way of operating, and therefore, by definition, these primary actions of God will be few and far between.
So he makes a distinction there then between secondary causes, which is the way God usually works, and primary causes, which are really God's extraordinary, unusual way of working. So secondary and primary. Primary, you might say, are miracles, whereas secondary are, the various laws of nature and that sort of thing, that the way God usually operates. So he makes a distinction there.
Right, or providence. That's what we call it. This is the way that it would have that history or whatever the event is lends itself out because of how God ordered the universe. So, even within the confines of theology, we have those two types of terms there. Well, second, the evidential or assigned value of a miraculous gap arises most naturally against a backdrop where the gaps are rare, unexpected, and have a religious context. And I think that last one is kind of almost the most important one, e.g., that these are positive theological reasons for their expected presence. Well, you have 600,000 men standing on the banks of the Red Sea, and just that wind comes at just the right time to move the water so that they can cross, and it just so happens to stop right before the Egyptian army can get to it, and therefore we know it has a natural cause if it even existed in the first place. Well,
Right.
except it has to have this religious context of why those 600 men were standing there and why at that particular time and why those particular people. That might have been the case that this area had good reasons for flooding and unflooding. I mean, that's probably true of any water body. Or how about the resurrection? Well, it just so happened to be in a world where anything can happen. Of course, you're going to expect life to come from non-life, and so why not a dead person coming back to life? Well, except it's in the context of someone who said, because of who I am, I'm going to raise myself from the dead. Well, that even puts more variables into it. The person who's shuffling the 52 card deck is going to tell you that he is, without any sleight of hand movement, is going to deal the best poker hand 5 different times. Well, you just have to assume that each one of those times will happen just from the nature of it. Now, it's highly improbable, but it is still possible. And so he's not cheating, right? It has to be the case that, he's just doing it. Or you have to assume he's either lying or that he's able to kind of produce this shuffling, and whether or not that's a different question. But again, then you're going into a realm of bringing in the idea of explanations there and evaluating.
All right, so gaps due to primary divine agencies are miracles that are in the minority because of these reasons. First, it's not how God usually works, right? It's primary instead of the secondary causes that God usually uses. And secondly, there are religious contexts, right? Okay, so he's working his way through this whole idea of the God of the gaps problem, right? So he says, fourth, then the distinction between empirical and historical science is helpful for understanding the God of the problem. Empirical science, he tells us, is a non-historical approach to the world that focuses on repeatable, regularly occurring events or patterns in nature, i.e. the relationship between pressure and temperature and volume in a gas, those types of things. So that's empirical science. It's non-historical. It's something that's repeatable, that, we think test tube, right, kind of thing. And then by contrast, he says historical science focuses on past singularities, right, that are not repeatable, right? Think of, the origin of the universe, the first life, the origin of various kinds of life, and so forth. And so he says advocates of this distinction between the empirical and the historical with regard to science claim that appealing to God's primary causal activity is legitimate in historical science, even if not in empirical science, because the former deals with cases where, theologically speaking, God's primary causal activity is to be found, while the latter, right, deals with God's secondary causal activity. So we can make that distinction, and we can see then this distinction between empirical and historical, and they both have different kinds of explanations associated with them, is the point he's trying to make here.
Right. Well, fifth, according to intelligent design advocates, one can use science to discover the products of intelligent design without having any idea how those products came about. For example, an archaeologist can know that an artifact he discovers was intelligently designed to be used in religious activities, even though he had no idea how the artifact was made. Let's just talk about crystal skulls and not the terrible Indiana Jones movie. I mean, there it's intelligently designed. We don't know how. It's carved against the grain, but it's smooth. And
we don't know who, right? Who
right,
did it?
right. So therefore, it just it tumbled in a little rock preserve until it only appears to be a skull, and it's made of this crystal material.
Right. And so his point here is that, intelligence needs to be part of our repertoire of explanations when it comes to phenomena we're attempting to explain, right? And to throw it out is kind of arbitrary. It doesn't even make sense. Right. We can use all the tools that we have to help us to explain what's going on. And intelligence can be one of them. And, he's suggesting, well, you don't have to say that it's even God, but we do use intelligence to help us explain various phenomena. right? And so why throw it out is the point he's trying to
Right.
make. All right, well, he says, finally, intelligent design theory differs from any form of creation science in this way. First, creation science proponents use biblical data to form theories and then attempt to test them empirically. So what he's doing is drawing a distinction between creation science on the one hand and intelligent design theory on the other, right? So he suggests that there is a distinction there. So what is it? Well, creation science uses biblical data to form theories and attempts to test them empirically. Intelligent design theory, on the other hand, he tells us, makes no reference to a sacred text like the Bible or to theological teachings. Instead, by using the intelligent design filter, which we mentioned earlier, intelligent design advocates believe that they can and have discovered scientific data that is best explained by an intelligent designer. Things like the origin of the universe, the origin of life, consciousness, causes of irreducible complexity, and so forth. He says it is the use of scientific evidence and the scientifically employed design filter, not biblical or theological teaching, that distinguishes, he tells us, between intelligent design from creation science. So he wants us to understand that there is a distinction here. He said it would seem then that the God of the Gaps charge is inadequate to motivate an abandonment of intelligent design and return to methodological naturalism. So this chapter then has been his kind of critique of methodological naturalism with regard to the only explanatory way that we have. And again, it's a kind of secondary critique of scientism, is what he's getting at here.
Right. Right. And so, you can still be a creationist and an intelligent designer and then, still reject methodological naturalism there. So, yeah. All right. So that's going to do it for chapter 13. And probably the next time we're going to do both 14 and 15 and a little bit of the, well, not a little bit, we're going to do the kind of the final page of the final plea that he has there. So if you're reading along with us, that's probably will be. We might split it up as well as we usually do for those chapters. But again, you can find all the links to the book in the description. And for all those pesky atheists who are having such a hard time of finding where that book might be in the short clips, there's a link that you can click on that shows you, or you can look at the cover photo and you can see the book that we're talking about. So I'm just throwing that out there because you guys seem to be a little confused over evidences right in front of you. And I don't know if that speaks to a full understanding of what you might fail to see in other places, but there we go. So the next time we'll be looking at kind of that how science and Christianity should be integrated. So here we'll make the positive case for that, and we'll do that next time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.